Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for tuning in today. Our topic today is mental health. We'll be talking about depression, eating disorders, ADHD, and more. My guest is psychiatrist Dr. James Greenblatt, who is the author of a number of books. The most recent is called Answers to Anorexia. Dr. Greenblatt, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Laurie. It's good to be with you.
So you have actually treated thousands of patients suffering from Anorexia Nervosa. Can you tell us a little bit about this condition? You know, most people know that it is about people who feel like they are fat. They think they're fat and actually they're starving themselves. Could you elaborate on that? And is it true that this really mostly affects teenage girls?
Well, first, mostly teenage girls, but there are men, and we are seeing younger kids, and we're seeing middle-aged women and men. So it affects all ages, all races, and I think it's hard to not start when we discuss anorexia nervosa to describe it as the most lethal psychiatric illness of all the other psychiatric diagnoses. So anorexia is a psychiatric disorder with medical complications. These are young women and men that starve themselves. They have a distorted body image. They think they're overweight when they're underweight, and they have very high risk of suicide and other mental health challenges.
You mentioned suicide and that this is the most lethal. A lot of us draw on our memories. I'm of the age where really I remember Karen Carpenter, the famous singer. She died of anorexia, but a lot of people don't know that people can actually die from this aside from suicide. Can you talk about how people die from anorexia? What causes them to perish?
Sure. Again, as the most lethal psychiatric illness, it is just devastating. So the vast majority is actually suicide, and a lot of professionals don't know this, but there are medical complications of electrolyte and heart abnormalities, but suicide is the most common cause of death in our patients with anorexia nervosa.
There's so much attention these days on the growing number of people who are overweight and obese. We know that this is a huge problem. And so it might seem strange to people that this is a huge problem of people who are actually starving themselves to death. How prevalent is this in our society today?
I think the broader concept of disordered eating is significant in our country and globally. Anorexia is a disorder that we're seeing across the globe. So disordered eating, there's 30 or 40 million individuals in the United States alone. Anorexia nervosa, as this restrictive disorder, is less. It's 1 or 2% of young women. So it's less, but more lethal. And rates are increasing. Before the pandemic, we had rates that have doubled in 10 years. And the pandemic has kind of increased the rates of all eating disorders, but anorexia to a point where there's long waiting lists to get into treatment programs.
We know that anorexia is when a person starves themselves. Can you talk about how this is different from bulimia? Bulimia sort of became in the headlines. A lot of people started learning about bulimia through Princess Diana. She kind of was open about that eating disorder and kind of brought a lot of attention to that. Can you talk about how anorexia is different from bulimia?
Our patients with anorexia nervosa are restricting their intake of calories, have this distorted body image, perceptual distortions. Their brain does believe that they're overweight when they're malnourished and underweight. Bulimics, they restrict their eating, but then will binge on large quantities of food and then have this compensatory purging. Sometimes it's vomiting, and it could be, after every meal. It could be 10 times a day or 1 time a day. And also for bulimia, there's compensatory exercising or other kind of means of trying to get rid of the caloric intake that they just had.
Getting back to anorexia, What I found some of the things that you said about anorexia, particularly about the malnutrition and the need for zinc. But before we get to how to treat anorexia, can you talk about what causes it and why people do it?
I think it's, I've been doing this for 30 years, and at least in the last 5 years, the research has now kind of made it clear that anorexia is a genetically driven illness. So there's a high heritability, is what we call it. So you need a genetic vulnerability and then multiple environmental risk factors. And that could be stress and trauma. And the work that I do is the kind of restrictive diets, vegan diets in adolescents, or even, you mentioned obesity, somebody being told by the pediatrician to lose 10 pounds because they're, quote, considered overweight. That change in diet for some individuals can lead to anorexia nervosa. But a genetic vulnerability and then multiple environmental stresses. And, with all the news on social media and Facebook, clearly social media exacerbates, we describe it as the gasoline on this fire, the concept of self-image and body image.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit later about depression and social media and things like that, but you kind of already got into it. Can you give us a quick idea, a quick summation from your professional point of view about social media and its impact on particularly young people, young women in particular?
I think all the press that's coming out is really important because I think there has to be regulations. But I think we're oversimplifying the problem. Social media didn't cause depression, anxiety, and anorexia in our youth, or in these epidemic and growing statistics. So, the way I kind of understand, and as I talk to patients, again, there's so many factors, oftentimes it's genetic risk factors. And, I use the analogy of these fires, and the kindling starts with the genetics and everything kind of adds to the fire. And then social media is the gasoline that can explode it, that support for this kind of maladaptive weight loss and the comparing oneself to these images on social media that aren't based in reality. So it's part of the problem, but it is not the entire problem.
What are some warning signs that a person and love, maybe even your own child, is anorexic? I mean, don't they try to sort of hide it?
Absolutely. Kids will, restrict their food and then might eat only around family. They might start wearing baggy clothes. I think the most concerning, risk factor is a change in diet. And that could be either a weight loss diet, or what is quite striking is a vegan vegetarian diet in a young adolescent has clearly been shown to be a risk factor for eating disorders if not monitored by dietitians or physicians to make sure they're getting adequate nutrients.
What can parents do, or partners do, loved ones do, if they suspect that someone in their life is anorexic? What can they do to help them?
Anorexia is, I believe, a treatable illness, and certainly in our young teens. We're seeing kids 8 to 10 years of age having kind of distorted body image and wanting to lose weight. And the earlier we can treat our kids, and that means getting them to a therapist, a dietitian, the pediatrician, to make sure there's no medical complications. The earlier we can get help, the more effective the treatment is. As we wait 16, 18, 20, or 30-year-olds, it's just get harder and harder to treat.
You draw a very interesting conclusion about people who are suffering from anorexia, about their nutrition, that they're deficient, particularly in zinc. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I got in the field about 25 years ago, and it was just striking to me that these are malnourished kids and adults who haven't eaten, nutrient-dense foods in years. The treatment model was not providing nutritional support other than, eating. And food is medicine, but to replete these nutritional deficiencies, I believe it takes nutritional supplementations. Now, zinc is one of the minerals we talk a lot about because when we try to get through puberty, we have higher needs for zinc. And a vegan diet doesn't have adequate zinc. There are a lot of plastics and environmental toxins that recently has got a lot of press, and those all bind zinc. So there's lots of reasons why our kids could be deficient in zinc. And it is one of these critical nutrients to get through puberty. And many of the symptoms that our patients struggle with can be related to zinc and other nutritional deficiencies.
All right, this is fascinating information. We're going to take a quick break and be right back with psychiatrist Dr. James Greenblatt. The book is called Answers to Anorexia. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're continuing our discussion with Dr. James Greenblatt, author of the new book, Answers to Anorexia. So, Dr. Greenblatt, you were talking about zinc in the previous segment and how important it is to get zinc in a person's diet, particularly someone who's going through anorexia. And you said that there are some foods that are high in zinc and also some things that sort of block the absorption of zinc. Can you go over those?
Well, zinc is mostly bioavailable for absorption in our gut from animal products. So that's why our vegetarians, in particular our vegans, are very high risk for zinc deficiency. And then there are foods, particularly our plant-based foods, our grains that have a chemical called phytates, and that inhibits zinc absorption. So it is just kind of a setup. Again, it has to be, or typically a genetically vulnerable kid who goes on a vegan diet, becomes zinc deficient. And some of the symptoms of zinc deficiency are just so common in our patients, not only with anorexia, but other mental health challenges like depression. You need zinc to make the hormone melatonin so we sleep better, and sleep problems. You need zinc for adequate digestion. And many of our patients with anorexia have difficulty digesting and feel full and sick upon eating foods. So there's a whole host of physical and psychological symptoms that result from zinc deficiency.
Do you recommend people take a zinc supplement?
Absolutely. I think certainly anybody on a vegetarian or vegan diet trying to get through puberty should take a multivitamin with adequate zinc. And some of our patients with anorexia nervosa might need higher amounts of zinc than in a multivitamin. But I believe zinc and other nutrients like fat, we've all been reading about fish oil, how good it is, but our patients with anorexia have been avoiding fat for sometimes years.
How do you get them to take vitamin zinc, or how do you get them to eat because they're just terrified of eating because they're so afraid of gaining weight? That's such a foreign idea for so many of us that certain people just won't put anything in their mouths. They're just so afraid of it.
Absolutely. We describe anorexia as it becomes deeper into someone's psychological process as a pathological fear. So there is a dread of eating and weight gain that is pathological and life-threatening. Oftentimes, when I'm talking with patients, I just discuss the role of these nutrients as helping them with their anxiety, their sleep, and their digestion. And that's true, and they'll feel better. So usually they're motivated to decrease their anxiety, they want to sleep better, and their digestive problems, the chronic bloating on refeeding, can all be improved by nutritional support.
You have actually, and you touched on it a moment ago, written a book about binge eating and integrative medicine for binge eating, another disorder. Can you talk about how you treat patients, just generally, begin to treat patients who binge eat?
Binge eating is a completely different diagnosis. It's actually the most common eating disorder, more common than anorexia and bulimia combined. The good news is binge eating is very treatable. Kind of use the analogy, of three legs of a stool. There's cognitive behavioral therapy. There is medications that are helpful, and the same concept of nutritional support. Even though some of our binge eating disorder patients are overweight, some are obese, they are also profoundly deficient in certain nutrients. So between therapy, nutrition, and medications, our patients with binge eating can be, I believe, completely treated to remission of all symptoms.
This is such fantastic information. It's information we all need to know, particularly the idea of people who are overweight or obese could actually be malnourished. We're going to take a quick break and be right back with Dr. James Greenblatt. The book is called Answers to Anorexia. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're continuing our discussion with psychiatrist Dr. James Greenblatt, author of the new book, Answers to Anorexia. Dr. Greenblatt, you mentioned that so many people who suffer from anorexia also have other psychological issues, and you mentioned depression. We recently saw that the incidence of depression among young people during the early phases of the pandemic through October 2020 had really skyrocketed, and this was a problem that was already terrible in the United States even before the pandemic. What are your thoughts about this increase in depression in young people?
I think the increase across all diagnoses for children have been pretty dramatic. They've been increasing, over the past 10 years, and the pandemic just kind of put major impetus to this increase. I think the social isolation and loneliness and the fear and the anxiety and the uncertainty of watching people die has been part of it. I also think the kind of staying at home and the obsession with social media has been part of it. But the rates have been increasing for a long time. And there's just so many parts of our environment, from the stress of our lives, but what social media has done is incorporate stress of everyone else's lives around the planet, that these kids are just kind of digesting and trying to make sense of. And I also go back to diet, nutritional deficiencies, what our kids are eating. And to me, one of the core factors that don't get discussed enough is sleep habits. We know that sleep deprivation affects mood, anxiety, and even suicide risk. And sleep habits have just deteriorated over the past 10 years for our kids.
What can parents do to help their kids get a better night's sleep? What do they need to know, for example, starting with how much sleep should kids get?
Well, I mean, it's kind of frightening how much kids need and what they get. Our adolescents need 10 hours of sleep. And if they're on their phone till 2 a.m, that's not going to happen. So checking in with a pediatrician, but, it's 10 hours for adolescents. So understanding that number is really important. And the scientific literature is so striking that sleep deprivation affects we use the term inflammation. It causes inflammation in the body. And we know that sleep deprivation increases rates of depression, but also suicide risk. This is a well-documented, but not discussed enough. Sleep deprivation for these kids that are vulnerable can increase suicide risk.
What can parents do to make sure their child gets enough sleep? I guess the first thing is getting them to bed at a decent time. How do you do that?
Well, I think, our best way of communicating with kids is communicating directly and helping them understand, about their health. So being able to listen to them, but also communicate and making sure they understand what sleep is and what they need. And then obviously adjusting bedtime, adjusting screen time. And, I think we've all heard school systems are trying to change what times school starts because sleep is so important.
Yeah.
And if your child is not sleeping, make sure you bring that to either a mental health professional or a pediatrician, because there are simple interventions, behavioral and or nutritionally, or for some medicines to support a regular sleep cycle. Probably the single most important thing we can do for prevention of mental health in our kids.
Wow, that is a very strong statement. All right, we're going to take one final break and be right back with Dr. James Greenblatt. The book is called Answers to Anorexia. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living, and we are continuing our discussion with Dr. James Greenblatt. Doctor, we don't really have very much time left in the program. Just can you please tell our viewers where they can get more information about this and your other books?
Yeah, the website is at jamesgreenblattmd.com. And I've written a number of books on kind of nutritional psychiatry, nutritional interventions for major mental illness, because our current models aren't sufficient and rates are continuing to increase. So we need to do better with our kids.
You know, you wrote a book, Finally Focused, about ADHD, and you did talk about sort of an integrative medicine. What's sort of the summation about that? When parents see their child acting out, they take them to the doctor and get the ADHD diagnosis, and then right away on medication. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the quick thoughts are, many kids benefit from medications for ADHD, but there are other contributing factors. And the book out kind of outlines those, but it's everything from lead and copper in the water, which is very common, to disturbances in the gut, to nutritional deficiencies of things like magnesium. So I just urge parents and doctors to not just run to the medication as the only solution. It might be part of the answer, but to look at these other kind of environmental, dietary, nutritional factors to make sure our kids have the best chance of succeeding.
How can people find an integrative medicine doctor?
Well, it's growing. The good news is 30 years ago, there was a few of us. Now there's growing pediatricians and mental health professionals. I would look up terms like functional medicine doctors, integrative medicine doctors. And again, for our kids, we want well-trained professionals trained in traditional psychiatry or mental health practices, who have had extra training in integrative and functional medicine.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Dr. James Greenblatt, the book is called Answers to Anorexia. Thank you so much for being here with us. One more time, what is your website so people can find more about you?
It's at jamesgreenblattmd.com.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. It was great to see you.
Thank you, Larry. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to you for tuning in to this edition of Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson, and we'll see you again next time.